Ben, I thought we'd start this episode, which focuses on the preaching of John, with our beautiful little Raphael predella panel, which he painted in about 1505. And I'm always struck here by the fact that even though John is raised up on this natural mound, almost like a pulpit, the attention seems to be more on the gathering of the figures coming to listen to him.
Yes, maybe we even sort of see ourselves, or encouraged to see ourselves in them, and it's helping us to think what it is to be a congregation, to listen to preaching. When I look at this, I always think of the famous early English composer Orlando Gibbons' setting of that early part of John's story, where he's preaching and all of Jerusalem and Judea come to hear him. It's called This is the Record of John. And one of the things that he sets is that the line that John preaches to the people, prepare the way of the Lord. He's summoning them to prepare themselves, and some seem more ready to be prepared than others.
And that's actually a very serious message and a quite stern one, and you can almost imagine that reflected in that very kind of composed but almost stern-looking saint. Yeah. There's something there. And then my eye is led around the painting to think about the different kinds of attention that people are giving to this very important message. This figure leaning on his chin seems to be very focused.
He's rapt, isn't
and attent, whereas this sort of more portly figure is slightly distracted and looking away.
Absolutely, he carries the world in his belly and has other things to think about, like his dinner.
Yes, exactly. But also the kind of sweet inclusion of these little children who seem to sort of be pulling at their father's leg.
Very sweet, and I'm fascinated by them because, again, part of the content of the Baptist preaching is this line that the Lord can raise up children of Abraham even from the stones, which is perhaps, I wonder, being illustrated here by the fact they're sitting on a rock and they're in a state of sort of innocence, aren't they? They're naked. And I have seen other images of the Baptist preaching where you often see a small infant. So perhaps it's a reference by Raphael or by the patron, a direct reference to this little detail in the gospel.
Well, this painting seems to focus a little bit more on the congregation and their response, let's say, to John's message. We have another painting here in the National Gallery of the same subject by an artist called Mola. And there it's quite interesting, the focus seems to be on the message instead, and so there's a slight nuanced change. So perhaps we ought to look at that picture next. This painting's by an artist called Francesco Mola, and it dates to about 1640. And as you'll see, it's the same subject as the Raphael little predella panel that we just looked at. But I wanted to show it to you because the focus seems to be quite different in this canvas. If you remember what we talked about in the Raphael, we talked about the congregation being the focus, the attention.
Yeah, they've shrunk here to just a few representative figures.
Exactly.
And John is centre stage.
He is. He's highlighted, quite literally highlighted. And if you look very closely, you can see that his mouth is open. He's very actively preaching in this moment.
And it's always struck me as one of the challenges of showing in a visual image the act of preaching, which is an auditory experience, and what as it were, visual tricks can you use to suggest a moment of speech.
Yes.
But the open mouth is obviously one, and the gesticulating finger captures in a physical movement something of what preaching is all about.
Preaching is directing.
It is directing
one's mind, isn't it?
And directing, specifically Christian preaching, is directing towards the figure of Christ. And again, a familiar passage from the Gospels comes to mind here. John says, "There is one who comes after me who is greater than I am, and who was before me," which is a peculiar way of putting it.
It's quite convoluted in the Gospel passage, but actually you can imagine someone like Mola picking that up and saying, how am I going to make that convoluted passage into something very legible? And in fact it is here, and you'll see that the reed cross and that pointing gesture of the Baptist just so clearly direct our gaze back to the figure of Jesus.
It is like a massive arrow.
It is. Actually, that gesture itself becomes a sort of an attribute of the Baptist. If you start looking at images of the Baptist, that it's always that pointing gesture, that's part of the message.
That's very true. Along with the other things we've already spotted, his camel skin, his reed cross, his banderole, the hand itself, and the pointing hand.
Stands in for the whole message.
Yeah.
And actually the National Gallery has a beautiful altarpiece by Parmigianino, which might have the most dramatic example of that pointing finger. I think we should look at that painting next.
It's nearby, isn't it?
Ben, this is the Parmigianino altarpiece that I was telling you about, with this extraordinary figure of John the Baptist.
And that preternaturally long finger.
Actually, it might be better to look at the altarpiece from here, because it really suits a bit of distance given its scale.
The finger reminds me, again, that preaching is a sort of pointing, but a non-literal pointing.
And actually that makes sense for this painting, for this altarpiece, because it's actually a non-narrative altarpiece as well. Non-literal.
Not a literal scene.
Yes, because you would never get this combination of characters all together. John appears almost preaching, but also in the wilderness, together with another penitential saint who we often see in the wilderness, a sleeping Saint Jerome in this case, and of course the Virgin and Child, the child to whom he points so emphatically. And it's not just that emphatic pointing gesture that strikes you. I mean, the face of John the Baptist in this is so engaging, almost that piercing gaze. And that gaze combined with this very complicated, twisting pose.
Absolutely.
Isn't that extraordinary?
Yeah, his legs face us, but his body then turns all the way around and backwards. And it reminds me that one of the images used by early Christian commentators of the Baptist was that he was a fibula, which is the Latin word for a brooch. And I think it's because the brooch is hinged in a certain way. And as we've noted before, the Baptist is like a hinge between the old and the new order of things. The last prophet, the first saint. And here his body expresses that sort of sense of being a hinge.
It's like pivoting.
It pivots and directs us further up and further into the painting. And the gaze initially arrests us, but says, don't stop with me. Start with me, but don't stop with me, go further. It's he becomes a sort of conduit for our own gaze.
And that is the message of the preaching. He is preaching and directing our view up towards this extraordinary Christ child who actually, particularly from this distance, you see he's stepping out towards us, that hovering foot. Yeah. So as the Baptist moves back, the Christ child moves forward. He's making way, as it were.
Yeah. I'm struck by the leopard skin that he has instead of his familiar camel.
Yes, it's sort of draped over his thigh.
It reminds me of the Roman god Bacchus, who's often depicted with leopard skin, and there is something a bit Bacchic, isn't there, about John?
Yes, actually in a few iconographic traditions he seems to appropriate or acquire Bacchus's attributes, and sometimes even wears a crown of vines in his hair. And there's something about associating those two kinds of wildernesses, the wildness.
Yeah, they're outside the norms of the city, and they both disrupt convention. Yeah, they destabilize things a bit.
Precisely, so he's sort of absorbed and taken on some of those characteristics of the Roman god. But isn't that extraordinary, the way there's also, if you make out just in the left-hand side, all of these amazing skins that he's wearing, can you see there's a cup attached to his belt?
On his hip.
Yes, exactly.
And that tells us what all of this preparing the way ultimately is for. He's preparing the way of the Lord, but for a very specific purpose, which is the baptism.
For baptism, exactly. And actually that will be the subject of our next episode.